So now we're having the second talk. It's Marta, Troya, Martinez from New Economic School, and it's something close to the heart of many of us, which is corruption.
Which one is?
Control.
Control. Okay. So thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Wren-Lewis, who is at PSC. And let me start by explaining very briefly what are relational contracts. So relational contracts are informal, ongoing agreements where the future that the parties have ahead is used as an enforcing mechanism rather than a court or any other third party. Okay? So this is a promise to pay a bonus to a worker that has been successful, or a promise to promote a bureaucrat that has done well. And so the idea is that the parties stick to this promise just because they want to keep on interacting in the future. Okay? And so there is a huge empirical literature that is growing that shows that actually this type of contracts are more important than what we have thought originally. Okay? So relational contracts are good because they allow, it's a very valuable alternative when court-enforced contracts, which are the ones we are used to, are not possible. Sometimes this is the nature of the transaction, like a court cannot say whether the client is happy with the consultant's work. Sometimes, as you well know, is that courts can be corrupt, they are too costly to use, so these are a very valuable outside option to that situation. The problem is that relational contracts can have a dark side. And this is because corruption is built on the same very mechanism that makes good relational contracts work, which is trust and reciprocity. Okay? And so that's why long-term relationships, these ongoing relationships, are especially advantageous environment for bribery to occur. Okay? So what we are going to do in this paper is that we start from a situation where a good relational contract is needed. Okay? Say to procure a quality that is not contractable. We cannot write a contract that a court could enforce. But as happens in many public and private organizations, the implementation of this relational contract is delegated to someone else, a supervisor. Call it manager, bureaucrat, whoever you might want to think about. And of course, it's well known that delegation usually goes together, can lead to kickbacks, either in the forms of bribes or other non-monetary benefits. Okay? So this is the first paper that looks at the relational contract that can sustain both this good action, namely giving some quality, and this bad action, which is sustaining a kickback, a bribe. So what are the questions we are after? So first of all, we want to see whether such a relational contract can, in fact, sustain both things, the exerting the effort and the bribery. And then we wanted to know whether delegating to such a supervisor would ever be a good idea. Okay, so when we started, we thought, obviously not. The supervisor has the same technology that the principal is going to have, so why would you ever win from having someone that can take bribes? And so we were surprised to find that actually the answer is not so simple, and I'll explain that in detail in some slides. Okay, and so then we want to know in which way the principal can tailor the contract so that to minimize the unnecessary bribery, so that it's better for the principal. Okay, so let me start by explaining what's the canonical relational contract model by Levin in 2003. And so usually in these models you have a principal and an agent. The principal pays a wage, which is contractable, say upfront payment to the agent, so that the agent exerts some effort. Okay? So the effort is costly, and the higher the effort, the higher the probability to have a high output rather than a low output. And so what we have here is a moral hazard problem. Effort is not observed, and the output that's observed but is not contractable. So this is how happy the client is with the work. Okay? So if the principal were to offer such a contract, obviously, the worker would not work at all because it's getting the wage no matter what. And so what the idea of relational contracts is that the principal can improve upon that situation by saying, look, I can observe whether you did well or not. So if I see that you did well, so I observe a high output, I'm going to promise that I'm going to pay you a bonus. Okay? But this is just a promise. So the worker goes, do the work, get a high output, and of course the principal can renege. Okay? So for this to be effective, the agent needs to believe that the principal will pay the bonus when it comes to. Okay? And so that's where the future of the relationship kicks in. If it's very valuable, the principal will stick to the promise. Okay, what do we do? So we add a supervisor. Now it's going to be the supervisor who is watching the outputs and deciding about the bonuses. Okay? And so in order to reward that supervisor, the principal will share the pie, the surplus, with the supervisor. So the supervisor will get alpha, and the principal 1 minus alpha. Okay? Now, because the supervisor does not fully care about the total surplus, it has incentives to tell to the agent, look, give me a kickback after you've been paid. Okay? So this is the side transfer. And of course, if the kickback is not paid, the supervisor is not going to go to courts to complain. So this is going to be part of the same relational contract. So who are these people? You can think that this is the firm owner, the manager, and the worker, or the supplier. You can have the government, a bureaucrat, and a firm that is delivering something for the government. Okay? And so what will the principal choose? The principal will choose this fixed wage, which is paid up front, contractable. It's going to determine the level of discretion of the supervisor, so it's going to limit how big that bonus is. It's going to put a bound, and it's going to find how much the supervisor should be rewarded, how much of the share of the pie the supervisor gets. So what happens if it's the principal who is in charge, the firm owner? This is the paper by Levine, and so if the principal is in charge, bribes or bonuses are equivalent, they are just transfers, so there is no bribes being used. And so basically the principal says, look, if I observe a high output, I'm going to pay you a bonus, otherwise I won't pay you anything. And the wage is used to split the surplus between the two. Now what happens if the supervisor is in charge? And that was the first surprising thing we found when we started working on that. And is that as compared to the principal, the supervisor has a comparative advantage, okay, in enforcing the relational contract. And in particular, it has more credibility when paying that bonus to the agent. So it can convince the agent to work harder. And the reason is because the supervisor cares less about paying the bonus, it just pays the alpha cost of that. But still, he cares a lot about the relationship because it has this future stream of kickbacks ahead. So basically what's going on is that the supervisor promises a bonus, it reneges, and what does the agent do? Okay, I'm not going to give you the kickback. I'm going to renege on my promise of paying you the bribe. Okay? So the supervisor has less incentives to renege on the bonuses because he's jeopardizing the corrupt relationship, the kickback. And it's quite hard to find data on bribes, but there is this chapter by Cole and Tran, and they have bribe data for 3 companies, and 2 of them, they show how when good relational contracting is important, the firms do exactly that. They use the kickback as an enforcing mechanism to make sure that the supervisor, whoever that person is in the organization, pays what it promised to pay. So they hold in all these circumstances, they hold the kickback until all the payments have gone through. Okay, so that was a nice example that we found. Okay, so there are 3 types. We find that there are 3 types of contracts depending on how to give incentives to the agent. The supervisor can give incentives only through bribes if the surplus is high, through both bonuses and bribes, and only through bonuses if the surplus is low. And I'm just going to go explain you that in a graph, which is easier. So here we have plot the effort bonuses and kickbacks as a function of the wage, which is a measure of how much surplus the supervisor and the agent have on the table. Okay? So if the surplus is really high, so we're in that area, what's the best? That the supervisor and the agent can do whatever promises they want because the future ahead is very valuable. Okay? So what's the best they can do? Well, they can collude on the bonus. The supervisor is always going to say that the performance has been high, so the bonus is always paid at the maximum. And how does the agent work? It works because the supervisor is giving him incentives through kickbacks. So he's charging a high kickback when the agent underperforms and a low kickback otherwise. Okay? As the surplus decreases, so does the spread. It's not credible anymore to promise such high and low kickbacks, and so the area shrinks. Now, as the surplus decreases even further, it's not credible anymore for the supervisor to promise that it will pay a high bonus even if the output is low. Okay? And so the supervisor starts using both bonuses and kickbacks as a way to give incentive. And finally, when the surplus is really low, then the kickback is the same no matter what the outcome, and all the incentives are provided through a high bonus and a low bonus, because that's cheaper for the supervisor. I said that before, it has more credibility. Okay? So this is the first best effort, the one that maximizes the total surplus. That's what the supervisor would like to implement, the maximum effort. And this is the effort that the principal could persuade the agent to do if she's in charge. The red line, which you can see it's quite above that, is the effort that the supervisor can implement if she's in charge. Okay? And so one thing that is interesting to look at this graph is that as we move from, as the surplus decreases and we move from using bribes only to also bonuses as an incentive device, we have that the effort increases. Okay? And so this is because as all of a sudden, the supervisor needs to use bonuses as an incentive device, and making the agent work becomes more of a reward, because with higher probability, the output will be high and a high bonus will be paid. Okay? So you can see that the effort even increases as you decrease the wage. So the takeaway message is that we might not, when there are bribes somewhere behind the scenario, a higher wage and higher bonuses might not lead to a higher effort, okay, because they are also used to implement the bribes. Okay. So that's like all the possibilities that can happen. If the principal can choose the contract, which one is she going to choose? We show that the best the principal can do is to choose the contract so that the supervisor and the agent are operating in the low surplus area. So only bonuses are used as an incentive device. Okay? And the reason is because that's what the supervisor is better off. For the supervisor, it's cheaper just to use bonuses, and so the principal wants the supervisor just to do that. Okay? And it comes to the last question, perhaps the most important. When should the principal delegate if she has the chance to? Okay? And so here I have plot, the black line is the profit of the principal with delegation, and the gray is without delegation. Okay? And so the different graphs, we look at things that make relational contracting more or less difficult. Okay? And so the takeaway message is that when it's difficult to enforce relational contracts, then it's better to delegate to a supervisor. When is this the case? Well, the first one is the value of the future, delta. The smaller delta, the less valuable is the future. Okay? And you can see that the profits with delegation are higher. So if the future is not very valuable, it's better to delegate. This is the probability that after exerting effort, you have a high output. Okay? So if this probability is small, relational contracts are difficult, and it's better to delegate. The last one is outside option. If your outside option when you terminate with that relationship is very good, you have more incentives to renege on that and just take your outside option. And again, when the outside option is very good, then relational contracts. Delegation performs better than doing it yourself. Okay, so to conclude, I hope to have convinced you that the same relationship can facilitate both a productive action and a corrupt action, and that the supervisor we have can obviously overpay the agent, namely pay too much and too often, like you saw that it was paying this bonus no matter what, and ask for a kickback in exchange. So that's the drawback. The benefit we found that we were not expecting is that, however, the supervisor faces a more relaxed and inconsistent problem. Because if the supervisor reneges on the good relationships, basically terminates the bad one, okay? And the supervisor cares about that. And that allowed us to answer the question, when is a delegation optimal and when is that? And so we find that delegation is optimal when relational contracting is difficult. And then the last two bullet points are about the type of contract that is optimal for the principal to determine. We've seen that a higher wage does not necessarily imply a higher effort when there are bribes underground, and that the principal can choose the agent's compensation in a way to control and deliberately allow how much corruption is going on between the supervisor and the agent. And I think that's...
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So questions? Yes, there's a question.
I think it's point number 3. Delegation is optimal when relations contract is difficult.
Yeah.
From your presentation, is there any way to conclude that at some point the bribery, the kickbacks are optimal?
The kickback, yes. Yes. So delegation, the reason why delegation might be good is precisely because there is the kickback.
Yes. But how to evaluate which kickback is optimal?
So this is the potential kickbacks that one can sustain according to some things that one observed, like the fixed wage. And so we show that for the principal, the optimal thing is to reduce the wage so that we are in that area. So because basically the kickback is a promise, right? I mean, the agent might promise to pay this, but if they don't have the surplus,
right. But if you promise too much, you may lose. But if you promise too little, you may not actually make the agent interested in doing something.
Yes.
So you've got to come up to something which, to a certain extent is an equilibrium. So
yes.
My question was whether or not you can suggest from your presentation that there is one.
Yeah, there is one, depending on the contract that the agent has, like the fixed wage, the bonuses. Yeah, there is one. Yes.
So in your story, basically, there is a range over which the kickback is an optimal bonus mechanism.
Is that optimal?
Bonus mechanism, kind
yes.
of, or incentive mechanism, correct? So the question I want to ask is a more general one, which is, in a regime with no corruption, does there exist an optimal contract that replicates all the incentives of a mixed payment with corruption system? So let's assume that you're in a different regime. Assume you're in a country in which ability to be corrupt is zero. Just make it simple.
Mm-hmm.
But we assume that you've already told us that you're in the regime in which this relation requires an optimal bribe.
Mm-hmm.
But now if you can't pay that bribe, is there a legal contract you can write? And that's at stage one. And the second, if you cannot do that, or whether you can do it or not, or in cases in which the bribe is optimal only the second best, in a Williamsonian sense, what is the optimal response of the firm, right? So in other words, if you can't write the bribe, but it's necessary, what happens? Do you get vertical integration, or do you get devolution, or whatever? You see what I'm saying? It's like, I want to take the next step.
Yeah, so there is a way which is to give. So the reason why we have this mechanism is because of the kickback, because the kickback is a function of the agent's utility, the supervisor is internalizing the agent's utility. So if you could write a contract with the supervisor that they share the sort of joint profits in a way that is legal, that could do as well. And I think maybe vertical integration is the obvious way to do that. So if the supervisor integrates with the agent, its utility is the utility of the supervisor, right?
But that's why I'm confused. But I thought the possibility of a bonus already gives you that. Like, can't you structure the bonus so that it's like, so you're saying the bonus cannot be structured so it's just like a kickback?
The bonus, so the principal will need to fully control the utility of the agent and give part of that to the supervisor, which is a very difficult contract to think about in reality. But it's precisely because, for the agent to pay this kickback, it's a function of the utility in the future. So it's really the internalization of that creates the mechanism.
Okay, so there was Alex first. Yeah.
So alpha is a choice variable, right?
Yes.
And you show that it's optimal for it to be between 0 and 1,
Yes.
which is sort of very interesting because it says that the principal wants to share something. So suppose I fix alpha. Do things change?
So you fix alpha and you still choose the other variables?
There is just principal has some bargaining power which is exogenous. And do the qualitative results hold?
So it would depend at which level the alpha is chosen. So if alpha is fixed at a level that it's consistent with being on this low surplus contract, the results still hold.
Oh, I see. So this will just move me along this.
Yes.
That's the only thing.
Yes.
I see.
So this is wage, but
Sorry. Sorry. This is okay.
Okay. Yep.
So essentially, you're limiting the choice of the supervisor to give a fraction of their surplus, as opposed to a lump sum money that
Yes.
he can choose.
Yeah.
So do you think this is a
You mean
little
between the
limiting?
supervisor and the principal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think this is limiting or do you think this matters for your qualitative
So
conclusions? Because this dependency must matter for the incentives of the supervisor. And if you're sort of divorcing the surplus, the amount of surplus from
the payment. So you are
Yeah.
saying that instead of sharing with alpha the profits, it's an upfront fee.
whatever principal chooses.
So if it's a fixed payment that it makes to the supervisor doesn't care about the effort and will have no incentives to make the agent work. So it needs to be dependent on why for the supervisor to incentivize the agent.
Right.
You can ask whether we can split this alpha, so you have an alpha for the output and another alpha for the wage bill, which is something we are working on. But still, you're going to have that. You need this alpha to be below 1. You need to have some corruption to trigger that mechanism going
So then
on.
my question is, when you look at real life contracts between principals and supervisors, do we see that or a fixed?
Well, I mean, this is the manager
Salary.
getting a share of the profits, if you want, or if you have the public. So if this is the government and this is the bureaucrat, you can think of this as like, the reputation that the bureaucrat is, how accountable you are making towards the people, the bureaucrat's job, whatever that is, if this is the mayor, I don't know who got it. So yes, but we want to generalize so that it's not one alpha, and our results, I mean, it's just going to be more relaxed, but our results we're going to go through for sure.
So let me ask a question. So you said delegation is kind of preferred when the relational contracts are difficult. Okay. Now you might think that when relational contracts are difficult, it means kind of the rents or future rents are small, and that's why they're difficult. And then kind of intuitively you would have less kickbacks, right? But kind of you are saying when the high rents, the relational contract is easy, and so the principal doesn't delegate, and then there are no kickbacks.
No, I don't say there is no kickbacks. You still have kickbacks. So even if the surplus is, you are in the low surplus scenario, you have one kickback, just is not used as an incentive mechanism. It's the same kickback no matter what the output is.
No, but when you take into account the optimal delegation decision, when the...
And we are here then?
Well, then here, okay.
So there should be some kickback going on. That's why alpha is smaller than 1, because if alpha is 1, there is no kickback. And so then precisely delegation is good because the rent that you need to give to the supervisor through corruption, through bribes, is small because they cannot sustain anything better, and yet it's beneficial because the supervisor can enforce things that the principal cannot. So you see, this is the effort that the principal can convince the agent to work if she's in charge, and this is the one of the supervisor. So it can do much better than the principal.
I have a kind of a conceptual question. You call these bribes and kickbacks, but when a private agent pays a private agent, there is nothing. It's not a bribe. It's just a payment. I understand that you could interpret principal as the government and the supervisor as a bureaucrat, but when you say that something is corrupt, then we normally assume that there is something which is normal or ideal, and then something is corrupt relative to this normal or ideal. So I wonder what is normal as opposed to which this is abnormal.
So this is corrupt because they are stealing, the supervisor and the agent are stealing the principal. So the kickback goes straight from
but the principal knows this.
Yes, but
You're
doesn't
just
mean
saying that it's optimal for him to choose this. To choose this scheme.
Yes, but suppose that he doesn't, suppose that there is a minimum wage, so he cannot freely choose what's the optimal scheme. The minimum wage is so high that we are going to be here. This is corrupt. He's not happy, the principal, with so much rent being stolen from him. So I'm not talking about optimal delegation.
So basically, you say that if the government gives someone a sum of money and say you need to build something and it doesn't care about what you do, then this is like inherently corrupt?
Yeah, if he doesn't care about whether the road is built or not.
No. We care about the road being built, but we do not watch how he spends his money.
In China, does the
No, I mean,
So I don't see how that maps. So you give. About the private, so I remove most of the quotes, but most of the quotes come from private firms that actually, the owner does not trust the manager, it will ask for a kickback and do not want to delegate. So I think corruption in the private sector is an important issue.
I don't believe that there could be corruption in the private sector.
That you do not believe?
How could be corruption?
Well, you are stealing from the owner.
No, but if the owner knows this.
So
That-
how you
if
call
it-
it? Kickback. It's called kickback in the literature.
It's illegal in the US. I think.
It's illegal, exactly.
It's illegal to
It's
do it
illegal in the
No,
US.
but you may know and tolerate, but it doesn't mean that it.
Even if it's in your contract, if the firm says that you could spend this money whatever you want,
No, of course not.
it's still illegal. No?
But it's illegal for private. So if an American does business
The
illegal,
whole idea of this model is that this is optimal.
Right.
So they might want to do this.
A little
Just
bit, a little bit of this is optimal. Too much, no. Too much will not, the road won't be built if there is too much corruption. So, the trick is to make the contract so that it is optimal.
If something is illegal, then the scope of it doesn't really matter. Okay? If something is illegal, to me, too much doesn't exist anymore.
That's right, but so if you cannot, because it might be legal, but you still need to detect it, right? So if you don't have perfect technology to detect, then I'm suggesting that you might want to change the contract in a way that to reduce corruption in your best interest. So the goal is to understand how these things are interlinked, so to say. But these quotes come from private firms paying kickbacks to other organizations, and that's illegal. That's definitely illegal.
Sorry.
Short on time.
Yeah, because it will be breaking after and I don't want
we
that the last
can talk
topic
later.
gets smashed and